I have noticed that many photographers and photographic artists put a lot of value on the camera that is being used and the technique that's being used in order to create art. But what if I told you that I believe the real reason we take pictures has nothing to do with equipment and has got nothing to do with technique, and everything to do with something that is a lot more human and far more powerful? You see, I think that every photographer or photographic artist, if you stopped them and said, why did you press the shutter, or why did you do the following, whatever it is, to create the art, they would give you an answer. But the answer may very well be technical. Yet again, what if I told you that I think creatively we've been looking in the wrong place when it comes to the motivation behind creating? And again, what if I told you that one sentence spoken by a person I deeply admire, completely changed the way I see photography and the creative process today, and even has impacted the way that I live my life today as a creative artist? That's the story that I'd like to share with you today. So before we dive into this discussion, let me give you a little background to the story. You see, earlier this year, I was invited to speak at the PSSA Congress. PSSA stands for the Photographic Society of Southern Africa, and it was their 135th National Congress that they were holding. And they had chosen to give the talk in a very interesting place. So when they asked if I would give the talk, and I asked them, where will it be held this year? They said it will be held in Cape Agulhas. Now, where is Cape Agulhas, I hear you ask? Well, Cape Agulhas is at the southern tip of Africa. So if you were to travel down Africa and reach the last part of landmass, and you had the Indian Ocean on your left-hand side and the Atlantic Ocean on your right-hand side, you would be at Cape Agulhas. And right next to Cape Agulhas, the talks were held in a small town, a seaside village known as Struisbaai. Now, this really interested me because, you see, uh, early on in my career, this area, Struisbaai, Cape Agulhas, and the surrounding area of the Overberg proved to be very, very good to me when it came to creating work in my early fine art photography days. And I could think of nothing better to go back to this area and talk to like-minded photographers and photographic artists. And the organizers asked if I would present the discussion on fine art and landscapes. So all was said. I prepared what I wanted to talk about, and I was ready for this discussion. But just before the event, in fact, the weekend before the event, I got a call from the event organizer. And he was asking if he could bring the keynote speaker that would be presenting at the Congress around to have a look at the work that was on exhibition in our gallery. So two things were interesting. The one was the work that was on exhibition was work from my students who were showcasing their work. So students who had done photography, art photography, and fine art photography up to masterclass level were showcasing their work. It was called the Ignite exhibition, and it was for emerging artists. So it was very fitting that he could be able to come and have a look at this. And not only that, Freeman Patterson himself is a great, unbelievable, and iconic photographer in the world today. He has written many, many books on the subject of photography as art. And on top of that, I mean, I prescribed a lot of his books as reading material and textbooks to a lot of my courses. So it was such a privilege to actually meet him in person and to show him around with the work that was on show. He came in and we had a brief discussion, and he started to walk around the gallery and have a look at the work. I noticed that he was very intent, and he stood and looked at every piece and gave it the time it deserved. So I couldn't help but say to him that if he wanted any more information, if he would like to know more about how these pieces were created, I'd walked the walk with my students. I knew quite a lot. And he stopped me and said, no, please don't tell me anything. He said, if you do that, you're going to take away the mystery. He said, really, I'm not interested at all in the equipment that was used or the techniques that were used. I'm more interested in why they have created this work. And that struck a chord with me because it's exactly what I've been professing for so long, that it's not about equipment. It's not about technique. It's about the desire to create and the message that you are wanting to deliver, whether it is a pure photograph, whether it comes through the art of photography, or in fact into the world of fine art exhibition photography. So once he had completed his walkthrough, we again had a brief discussion around the importance or non-importance of the actual equipment and the technique within the process of creating photography and art. And when he left, I took, what could we call it, an executive decision all on my own. I didn't even contact the organizers, and I decided I was going to change my talk. I was going to change my talk from fine art within landscape to something far more meaningful, something a lot more deeper than this, and that is why we actually create photographs and why we use photography as part of a creative process in order to present art. And that, my friends, is what I'd like to talk to you about today. So allow me to open up my presentation and we can get started. So today's discussion is, as I've said, about the art of photography. And I want to show you this picture first. I'll talk about it a little bit later, but this photograph really holds the central position into today's discussion as we go through the art of photography. I must just also point out that this is the small craft harbor in the area of Struisbaai, which is a fisherman's village, really. But I'll come back to all of this in a moment. But just keep that in mind. And like I said to today, we are talking today not about how we photograph. So this is not about technique. This is not about equipment. This is not about craft. You're not going to learn any of that today. In fact, I think what you will learn today even holds more value than this. What we're going to talk about today is why we photograph, the importance of why we photograph. And you will also see that what we'll discuss today will bring value to your photography in any case. In fact, it's going to bring more value than if we discussed technique itself. So this is the exhibition itself that I was talking about earlier. This is the Ignite exhibition and Emerging Artists Showcase. This was on for the first 2 weeks of August. And on show here was a combination of art photography, fine art photography, pure photography, and I'll talk a little bit more about these three genres a little bit later on in this discussion. So that was the actual show itself. And here is one of Freeman Patterson's great quotes. In fact, I think this is so pertinent to what we're going to be discussing today. He says here that no amount of technical knowledge and competence is of itself sufficient to make a craftsman into an artist. That requires, he says, passionate caring about ultimate things. That is so true and so profound. I want to talk today more about the memories and the stories behind photographs. You see, a camera doesn't just record light. In my opinion, a camera records life. And that's sometimes the key that we don't unlock when we go out to take photographs. You see, behind every photograph of meaning, there should be a moment that mattered. And very often, this moment that mattered comes after the actual taking of the photograph. So the camera itself is, yes, I agree, an instrument to record light. But what we sometimes fail to understand is that a camera sometimes gives us the permission to explore without reason or excuse. Now, that's not going to make too much sense now, but hopefully as we get on with this discussion, it's going to make a lot more sense. So let me talk about this photograph. And hopefully this will give you some idea why I say that the camera doesn't just record light, it records life. And also the camera is or offers a reason to create without excuse. And hopefully this will give you an idea of why I say so. I spotted this old shed also in an area where that was also very good to me when I was starting out in my fine art photography career. The area I was photographing in here had a lot of subject matter, everything from rural lands like this, some of them organized, some of them disorganized. It also allowed me to shoot some interesting people photography and even some normal landscape photography. So this area was good to me. And one afternoon when I was driving around or scouting for things to photograph, I spotted this building. Now, it's not a building, it's actually a small shed. And the shed is perched on some grass, and the grass is in the middle of a plowed field, and it is so unusual. I think very often when it comes to photography, it's about looking for unusual things, and then, unfortunately, sometimes they get photographed normally, which means they're not unusual anymore. But in this case, I knew that in order to photograph this, I would have to get onto the farmer's land. I would also have to get down into the field, and I'd have to get right next to this shack itself. In that way, I could actually blow it out of proportion and make it or keep it as an original, authentic, and interesting composition. But the light wasn't great that afternoon. The skies didn't have any cloud cover. And I decided to give it a miss, but I earmarked this as a possible option. The very next morning, I got up really early, I don't know, 4 o'clock in the morning, just to have a look and see what the clouds were doing. And a cold front had started to head through, and I could see that the eastern horizon was a little bit lighter, which meant that some light would come through sometime around daybreak. So I decided I was going to go and give this a go. But you can appreciate that I couldn't knock on the door and ask for permission to enter in onto the land. Fortunately, the gate itself was unlocked, so I let myself in. And fortunately, the driveway, or what we call it, the gravel road that went into the farmland, headed all the way down to the farmland itself. So I realized that I drive an old Land Rover Defender, so it makes quite a noise. I decided that I would rather switch off the motor and freewheel down onto the land. Only problem is that it goes right past the farmer's house and dwelling area. So I guess when you're that motivated to photograph, I sometimes, and certainly for my own photography, I'd rather beg forgiveness than ask for permission if it means I'm going to miss the shot. And the light was coming up quickly, so I couldn't help myself, and I freewheeled down and got onto the land itself. And I was able to take the photograph without making too much noise. I think I only took maybe 2 or 3 exposures, nothing more, because it was all working. And I knew I had something special here and it was worth the effort. But I wanted to leave as quietly as I came. And in my excitement, once I'd taken the photograph, when I closed the back door of the car, I was a little bit too loud. And as I closed the back door, I knew I was in trouble because the dogs started barking up at the compound or dwelling area of the farmer. So I thought, well, let me get out of here and face the music if I have to. But I didn't realize that the farmer would be out that quickly, the owner of the land or the farmer, whatever of the two he was. And as I drove up the hill heading past the dwelling, there he was standing with a shotgun. And he held up his hand and stopped me. And he was also dressed appropriately to scare anybody. He had this T-shirt that had, the sleeves had been torn off. He had a really bad stubble. His eyes were quite red from possibly the night before where he had overindulged or what have you. And he wasn't in the best of moods. And I stopped and I hadn't even thought of what I was going to say, and his question was, "What are you doing here?" And the only thing I thought of answering is I said to him, "No, I'm a little bit lost." And I have to tell you this, but uh, next to his house, he had about 3 or 4 white pickups, Toyota pickups, the Toyota Hiluxes, which is iconic for farmers. That's what they use. And he stared at his 3 cars and he looked back at me and he said, "No wonder you lost. You drive a Land Rover." Well, that broke the ice and we had a little bit of a laugh. And then he said, "No, really, what are you doing here?" So I said to him, "No, there's a little shed that you got out in your farmland. And, I thought they would make a nice photograph. So I didn't want to wake you up early in the morning." So he said, "Okay, well, you shouldn't be here. Please don't come back again." And he said, "You know the way out." So I was able to get away with that. The reason I'm telling you all of this is because in that moment where I decided I was going to take this photograph, and not only that, in the moment of taking it and now being able to tell you the story, that indeed is the main reason why photography for me and photographic art for me is so special, because it's a memory that I will never forget. Every time I see this photograph, I remember that moment when I went out to take it. So you see, perfection is one thing. Creativity is another. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how we look at it, the camera invites perfection. It's a perfect instrument in order to create reality. But sometimes, and that's what I want to also talk about today, is that the imperfection could sometimes tell a better story. And maybe not in this photograph we have just looked at, but certainly in others we will talk about a little bit later on in today's discussion. So let's come back to the photograph I showed you earlier. This photograph of Stray Spy I didn't take. This photograph of the children jumping off the jetty, it wasn't my photograph. This photograph was taken by a colleague of mine. In fact, he was a student of mine who later became a lecturer, fellow lecturer and business partner in our photographic college. They're one of the most talented photographers I have ever met in my life. Incredible gifting when it came to creativity and to be able to extract story and emotion out of photography. His name is Dirk Boshoff. And Dirk took this photograph shortly after he had finished his year training with me, and he went out to go and photograph some work for his own portfolio. He ended up in the area of Cape Agulhas and Stray Spy, which I had never visited, and he came back from his trip in the surrounding Overberg areas, and I was looking at some of his work on the light box that he had taken. This he photographed on film. This was taken, I think, on a Mamiya RB67 on slide film, but I remember him putting down this photograph and a few others and asking me what I thought. And I was blown away by the color. I was blown away by just the emotion in this picture. It just the whole story spoke to me. And when I asked him, "Dirk, where did you photograph this?" He said to me, "In a place called Stray Spy." And I said, "Well, where is that?" And he pointed out where it was. And I immediately earmarked that area as a possible area to continue to work on my own portfolio of work. And I said to him, "It's a place I really need to visit." As good fortune would have it, one of my other assistants, Honey, she had family who lived there, and she overheard the conversation and said to me, "Well, I can always put you in contact with my family who live there. So if you need to find a nice place to stay over, or you want to sort of sort yourself out, or you need more information, I'll put you in contact," which she did. And shortly after that, I headed to this area to go and photograph work for my own portfolio. And it's because of this photograph that Dirk had taken. I must make it very clear that while heading down to the area, although this photograph motivated me to go there, I wasn't heading there to photograph children jumping off a jetty and swimming in a beautiful harbor. That's not what I was after. I was after the sheer beauty and the richness that this area offered for photography. And that is a very important statement because I want to talk about that in a moment. Here's just to give you some idea of what I ended up photographing. And remember, this was in the early days of my art photography. This is one area that is there, so you can see there's beautiful dunes that surround this area as well. And for me, this photograph is pretty, but it is fairly predictable, to say the least. This is the second one that I took in the area, and this is why I say sometimes imperfection is sometimes better than perfection. While I was photographing these two tufts of grass, the photograph itself looked a little bit flat to me, and I didn't have much hope for it, but I took it in any case. And if you look carefully on the left, you'll see that there's this little catch light, which also appears slightly on the right-hand side, the grass on the right. Well, this was a torch I had because this was early hours of the morning and I needed to get there and I needed a flashlight to get there. And I'd forgotten to switch the flashlight off. So the flashlight was busy shining on the grass. I was photographing on film, which means that I didn't have any way of knowing what I was getting. And when I processed the film, this little catch light is the reason why this composition in fact works. So as I progress with my story, let me give you some orientation here. So this is a portion of the Bay of Strathspey. The harbor is now on your right-hand side, and this is a long, uninterrupted beach, I think 18 odd kilometers before the next fishing village known as Arniston. And apparently this is the longest uninterrupted beach in the Southern Hemisphere. And when I say uninterrupted, there's no rocks. So any of the boats who are in distress, especially out due to the Cape of, or the notorious Cape of Storms, instead of being grounded on rocks or running aground on rocks, if you could aim for this area and get yourself here, you pretty much would be able to beach the craft. Well, there was a fishing boat roundabout here, which I had found on one day when I was walking the area to see what else there was to photograph. It was a small craft that had unfortunately run aground and had now started to weather and was not taken off. And I wanted to photograph it, but the angle of light meant it would be an early morning photograph. The very next morning, I went all along there with all the equipment ready to photograph this boat. And unfortunately, there were fishermen. I say unfortunately because, again, this is full photography day. So you've got to understand that when it came to printing, if there was any error in your transparency or in your negative that you were photographing of, in order to fix that up, uh, one would have to either take it through to scanning and put it into Photoshop, which was a little bit of an antiquated program at that stage, which took hours to fix, or you'd have to have it airbrushed out. So you wanted to photograph as perfect as possible. And the fishermen had left footprints all past the boat and down to the beach. The very next morning, I went out even earlier, and once again, the fishermen were there. The third morning, I decided, no, I've got to do something about it. So I got there really early. And I think it was something like 3 in the morning prior to the fishermen arriving. I had a big, strong light with me. And as they arrived and came walking through the bushes, I shone the torch at them and said to them that they couldn't come that way because there was an issue. They wanted to know what was the issue. And I said, no, we're doing an investigation, a police investigation. So they need to go further up the coast in order to do their fishing, which they did. I felt a little bit bad about that, but you have to do what you have to do, and I was able to take the photograph. So this is the picture itself that I'm talking about. And as you can see, there is no footprints. The high tide had washed the footprints away, and I was able to get a clean photograph and just use the torch to just put a little bit of light on the wood on the shot. So almost painting or drawing in with a little bit of light during the exposure. Again, a story for me that when I see this photograph, it is a reminder of not just what I photographed, but the reason why I photographed it and what happened during that time. So when we talk about perfection, Perfection itself, is it your friend or is it a foe? And I think that perfection in photography or photographic art, or where photography is part of a process, can often polish off the soul, or polish the soul right out of a photograph. And we need to be careful of that. There's times we need to create with perfection in mind, but very often it's that perfection itself that can cause a lot of trouble. I mean, Scott Adams said that creativity is allowing yourself to make mistakes. Art is knowing which ones to keep. And I really agree with that. So for a moment, let me talk a little bit about the truth. Sometimes the truth hurts. And certainly in my career, that is exactly what happened to me. You see, even at the time that I had taken the photographs I had just shown you, I was still working as a commercial photographer at that stage, so teaching photography full time, really. And then also at the same time, I had a commercial photography business where I was photographing products for people. And in this case over here, a lot of it had to do with advertising. So whether it was cars or whether it was wine or whether it was creative ideas, it doesn't matter. But it all had to do at that stage with technical photography and technical lighting. I can tell you now that I can admit it certainly that at that stage, I think having taught photography for so many years and then having practiced photography side by side, certainly in the world of commercial photography and studio and creative or controlled lighting, not creative lighting necessary, but controlled lighting, I could pretty much light anything. You could just about bring me any subject you wanted, and I could make it look rather attractive if it was photographed for magazine or for advertising or whatever. And that's one of the reasons I suppose a number of my clients would come to me. And I'd got into this groove of lighting and being able to light. I remember one day on a shoot, the creative director came to me and we were busy setting up something. And they mentioned that the lighting was great. And I said to them, do you know, you may come up with the idea or the composition, and you can give it to me, and you should just be employing me for the lighting. I meant it tongue in cheek because very often when the creative directors came on set, they had a very clear idea of what they wanted, and they weren't prepared to listen to your input. So at the end of the day, it was the lighting that they were there for, and then the technical ability to record the image properly. And yet, I loved every moment of this. This for me was a great learning space to be able to practice what I was teaching. And it was at the height of this that I overheard a discussion that had to do with one's signature or one's style. I had just delivered a lecture prior to that where I was talking about uh, how you would be known by your style and how you can create a style. And whether you're photographing different subject matters, your style will still come through, and how that could be your very DNA within your creativity. So this discussion left the lecture room and headed off into the canteen. And I overheard some of my fellow lecturers discussing what had just been taught in the lecture room, or what I had just spoken about in the lecture room. And they were asking one another how they would identify one another's style. And I couldn't help but eavesdrop and just listen. And the truth, as I said, does hurt, because one of the lecturers asked, so how would you know Martin took the photograph? How would you know it's one of Martin's pictures? And I speak under correction, but I think it was Dirk himself who said you will always know Martin's work because it is technically perfect. And he meant it as a compliment, no doubt. But it hit me like a ton of bricks. I realized on that day that I was on a predictable walk. My work was predictable, and I've been known for my technical perfection, which is in fact my predictability. And it was shortly after that that I decided that I'm not going to be going down the road of commercial photography anymore. In fact, I sold off a lot of my equipment. I gave a lot of my equipment to my assistant who had worked for me, also Martin Short, who had worked for me for about 4 years. I gave him some of the equipment, and I also handed over all my clients to him, and said that he needs to take over that part of the business because I needed to go and find my own soul. I needed to go and find my own DNA and my own reason to create. This was the very first photograph of meaning that I took as I progressed outdoors, but without lighting equipment, just with camera, lens, and the will to create. And when I show this picture, a lot of folks say, "But where did you photograph that?" Because it looks like some exotic island somewhere in the middle of nowhere, when in fact, an acre of diamonds is in our own back garden. And for those of you who live in Southern Africa, you will know about the Great Vaal Dam on the Highveld in South Africa. And this was taken there. And you'll also know by looking at it that the Vaal Dam doesn't look anything like this. It was just that this was a location I had visited over and over and over, but on a day, this great storm came through. There was the pressure system around the dam changed quite dramatically, and at this stage, the actual storm came in quite quickly, and I was able to get 2 or 3 photographs. But I knew when I took this photograph, something inside me broke. Something inside me. It felt real. It felt original. It felt unpredictable. And I couldn't contain my excitement. I took this, again, this was done on photographic film. And then just down the road from this particular location, it's an old marina that had been abandoned. I remembered seeing an old car on a pole, and I decided to drive out there and go and take a photograph of it as well. So the background here is exactly the same storm that had just passed through. So it was nice and moody, and it had a nice storyline to it. So I ended up photographing this on the same day. 2 photographs that then defined the direction I was going in. And the abandoned collection, which I said earlier I've been busy with, or was busy with, for like 14 odd years, had started. And I already had this photograph in the bag, and I was on my way. I had this creative freedom and this energy building inside, wanting to just create with light in a natural environment, but looking for more a reason to create rather than just photographing for the sake of photographing. It was a few weeks later that I photographed this old caravan. This was taken very close to the photograph that I spoke to you about earlier, with the little hut on the grass in the farmer's land. Again, a very easy photograph to take. Beautiful weather coming through. Light was exquisite, and everything was there. And I was able to get this, and I was really on my way. I had found this new way of photographing. I had found this something inside me that was bubbling with creativity, wanting to create more, and I could hardly contain myself as I left the world of studio photography behind. I just also want to say this is very important. I put lots of value on the days I was working with lighting to that degree, because I realized that I could recognize and work with natural light a lot easier, because I could recognize the characteristics of light in the studio, but now played out outdoors where you've got less control. And that really set me on my way. So let me jump forward 10 years. Here you will see in this photograph that it is very different from what I've just shown you. A lot had evolved over the 10 years, and I was busy doing a lot more art photography and a lot more fine art photography. I was doing a lot more in-camera creating, where I was using multiple exposures, in-camera, high dynamic range, and all that sort of stuff. trying to create images that came out of the camera as a raw file, but they were already artistic. This was a washing line in one of the seaside villages, similar to Stray Spy, which I'd taken. Remember, I spoke to you earlier about the little town of Arniston, which was on the other side of Stray Spy. This was photographed in that town. And this was also in camera, multiple exposures combined with high dynamic range. I must tell you here that this lady was delightful. She came walking past with her dog, and I could see that there was something to be had here. And she walked past, but I wasn't quite set up or ready to get it. And I went out and asked her very kindly to walk past again, which she did. And then I tried again, and any of you know, if you've worked with in-camera multiple exposures, and certainly if we're throwing exposures either side, it doesn't always work. So I had another failed attempt. So I went and asked her again, is there any chance you can just walk through again? And I did this 4 or 5 times, and she obliged, which was wonderful. At the end, I got the photograph, the one you see here, and I was quite chuffed with the result. So I said to her, can I show you the photograph? And she obliged. She looked at it, and she looked at me, and then she looked at it again, and then she said, I hate to tell you this, but I think your camera's broken. And I said to her, you don't like it? And she said, no, she doesn't like it. I said, you don't want a copy of it when I'm finished? She said, no, he's got no value for this at all. And she headed off, and I've never seen her since. So here's what I want to talk about next. And as we progress, I think you're going to start to get an idea of why I said that it's more important today that we discuss the reason why rather than how. And what I want to bring up at this stage is, remember the moment I told you about where we drove into this area called Stray Spy, and motivated by the photograph that Dirk took. And I said to you that my intention wasn't to head off to this harbor and to photograph some children jumping off a jetty. My motivation was coming into an area that was rich with composition and options and possibilities. And that's something I do notice, certainly when it comes to photography, amateur or professional photography in some cases, where too many people walk this fine line. And sometimes the line is not even a fine line, it is a defined line, where they go out to capture something similar or something as close as possible. And that is so dangerous, because that's now leading towards plagiarism, which I think is something we have to be aware of. Yes, not everybody will photograph the same picture exactly the same. But if we go out saying, well, if I put my camera in this position, if I get some children out to come and do some swimming, if I make sure that there's a boat that is brought up to the jetty and tied up, and I ask them to splash into the water, and I wait for a nice day when I can get the turquoises and blues, you are in a plagiarizing environment. And that is not creative at all. And that's where I'm talking about, do we copy what we see, or are we inspired by what we see? I believe that one shouldn't be a carbon copy at all. One should let inspiration from many different sources merge into something that only you can create. There's nothing wrong with taking a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I like the color that this photographer has used. I like the mood that I see here. I like the strict composition that's been used, whatever it is. But go out and find all these elements that you like, and then make it your own. It is really important when it comes to being creative and bringing your own signature to your work. There's a wonderful book by Austin Kleon called Steal Like an Artist. Again, one of these books I use as a reference book in my teaching. And he says here that what a good artist understands is that nothing comes from nowhere. We are all inspired by others, whether you are inspired by art itself, whether you're inspired by photographs, whether you're inspired by watching a TV series or watching a documentary, it doesn't matter. We are inspired all the time. He goes on to say that all creative work builds on what came before, and nothing is completely original, which is true. But then the same is also true. Going out and copying, word for word, item for item, is dangerous and is plagiaristic. And we need to be careful of that and aware of it. Here's another example of what I'm talking about. This photograph was taken by Peter Corbett. Peter Corbett is a master landscape photographer, and he's represented by our gallery. And this photograph was printed really big and was on show in our gallery. And visitors to the gallery really loved it, and it was purchased by a number of people. This was photographed in an area of the Western Cape known as Tulbagh. It's a little town that is basically surrounded by mountains. The mountains are known as the Horseshoe, and he photographed it just on the left-hand side of the horseshoe itself. And at a stage, we decided as a family that we wanted to visit Tulbagh because we wanted to break away from a very busy time at that stage. And also, I wanted to break away where I wasn't necessarily chasing after landscapes and light, but rather spend family time. So we were staying in Tulbagh. It was in the height of summer, and in the summer you just don't get much mood coming around. So it's a great motivation to rest and to just take a break. Well, during the week that we were staying there as a family, halfway through the week, my daughter comes to me with the weather app and says, Dad, do you see that there's a front coming through? There's some weather coming through tomorrow. Don't you think it's an opportunity just to go and do some photography? And I said, it's fine. We can go together and we can go and have a look. The next morning when we got up, the weather indeed was there. It actually started off as a very misty morning. And then the mist started to lift, and you could see the weather and the clouds building. And we came over this hill, and as we dropped down, this composition was in front of me. And I looked at it and I said, I've seen this somewhere. And Samantha looked at me and she said, why you look so surprised? And I said, this is the shot that Peter Corbett took. This is where he must have shot it from. There was a little hill on the right. And I said, I'll bet you anything he was on top of that hill. And that's where he got that beautiful landscape panoramic. One could actually dig out the camera, the tripod, run up onto the hill, make a similar composition, photograph it and say, that's mine. But yeah, something inside me would never allow that. And I said to her, let's just get out of here because the temptation is far too high. Let's just go somewhere else. So we headed off into the heart of the actual horseshoe area. Again, I found a gate that wasn't closed properly. And we went in onto the farmer's land. The farmhouse itself was actually quite far away. There you can see it right down in the bottom. So the house was far away. I knew that the noise of the vehicle wouldn't interrupt them. Again, it was early hours of the morning. You can see up at the top, the first light was starting to break onto the mountains. So headed in onto his land, went up as high as I could, and I managed to get this photograph. Now, this I'm very happy with because it's very different, and it's completely a different mood altogether. And my daughter and I also have an agreement. We don't photograph the same thing. So she was almost in tears when I told her, no, I spotted this first and I'm taking it. That was the other agreement we had. If you see it, you call it. But if you call it, you photograph it. So she had to go off and go and do something else. And I photographed this. But as I was finishing off the photograph, here once again was the farmer heading towards me, who was also quite or looked quite upset. In fact, he wasn't. He was just coming to find out what we were doing. He could see I was using a camera and a tripod, so he put two and two together. He was a really nice guy, and he also told me that he had better areas on his farm that looked over the other side. And we went there, and Samantha managed to get some really, really good black and white photography. So again, you can see that that you can be inspired by somebody's photograph. You can even recognize somebody's photograph. But the last thing you want to be doing is copying somebody's photograph. Well, a few months after that, the weather had started coming through. It was in the height of winter. Once again, we were on a trip together. Samantha spotted this. She said, "It is mine." And I left her to photograph it. And in fact, I think it is even more beautiful than the composition that I'd managed to catch 6 months earlier. So where does that bring us? Well, I want to talk a little bit about pixels to paint, because I need to start tying this up into, or wrapping this up, to give you a look into why I say photography, art photography, or fine art photography, whether it's camera related, whether it is technique related, why it is so important. So for me, it doesn't really matter where the camera enters into the creative process. It doesn't matter. Photography is an exceptionally powerful tool to me. So whether it comes in the beginning of the process as a pure photograph processed and presented, whether it comes in during the process, so where you start with a photograph and then take it through handcraft techniques and end with a photograph, or whether the result that you started with ends with a photograph, doesn't matter. What does matter is that it's driven by artistic intent. So let's come back to Dirk's photograph over here, the very reason for today's discussion. Have a look at this. While I was out a while later revisiting Strasbourg, because I went back often, because it's such a rich area to me. In fact, one of our galleries now, one of our art galleries is no more than, I don't know what, 70 kilometers from Strasbourg in the Overberg area. I mean, I just love that space. I was there one day visiting the same harbor. The wind was up, the weather was coming through. The light wasn't great, and there wasn't an opportunity for a photograph. So I ended up taking this photograph just because I was there in any case, and I just took it. I knew I'd probably never use it. Well, I was a little bit wrong, because it ended up forming a really, really nice composition for a painting. So where the photograph now is the inspiration for the painting. So I talk about photography, pure photography, art photography, fine art photography. But here I'm talking about where the photograph becomes the reason for the creation. And this is a painting. Here's another example. A landscape that's okay as a photograph, which looks very different when painted. So the photography here is the source of inspiration. Here is another example. The reason I'm showing you this is because this was some of the techniques that Freeman Patterson had seen on the wall during the exhibition, where photographs were painted by my students based on the inspiration of the photograph itself. So here's an example where photography has been used in a number of different parts of the composition. So this is a painting that I did where the little house comes from the desert area of Southern Africa. The clothesline comes from Arniston, very close to Strasbourg. And the tree is actually from our own National Botanical Garden. The foreground I just painted from memories of what a beach would probably look like if the house was perched up on a hill. Here, photography has been used as an inspiration, and the pieces have been put together as an artwork. So you ask, photography or painting, or photography or mixed media? Well, I say to you, peaches and cream. If you say pick between photography or painting, or pick between photography and then creative processes or craft in order to get you to a result, well, I'd rather not pick. I would rather have both. You see, painting or photography or any combination, the medium matters less than the memories you create and the joy that it brings you to be able to create in the first place. That's exactly what Freeman Patterson was saying. Don't tell me about how. Tell me about why. And that is what is so important here. And there's a lot in that sentence that needs to be unpacked. If you have a look at these facets of photography I've been talking about, on the left you've got photography, pure artistic intent, picking up the camera and going and taking a photograph, which you will use in any shape or form, whether it is in a display format or what have you. Art photography for me is where the camera comes into a creative process, yes, whether it is used purely as photography or whether you're using a technique to get there. But the intent is to display it in a public area or in an area where design is more important than a message. So this is the type of photography or art photography you will find in a hotel foyer. This is the type of photography you'll find in hotel rooms, in the boardrooms of a company. It doesn't have a political point of view. It doesn't have a religious point of view. It's not going to stir up the viewer. Its pure intent is design. And then you've got fine art photography where you or we as the artist, it's a lot more about what we want to say as we create the art. So the intent is definite. And it is the type of work you will find in galleries, in art galleries, where the artist's view is as important as what is being created. And here, it doesn't matter. It can question society. Art has always questioned society, and it's no different here. And then we talk about photo to painting, where we photograph with the specific intent of being able to take that photograph and use it to be able to create a painting from it. These are the 4 levels of where photography for me can be broken up and fits into a specific genre. So looking back, certainly in my career as a photographer, photographic artist, and artist, there are lessons that have come along which have really helped. And looking back, I wish I had learned these lessons earlier in my career. The one lesson I really wish I had learned early in my career is that our photographs carry the stories and shape us and inspire others. You know, in professional photography, picking up the camera, I suppose, was an artistic act, yes, but in many cases, picking up the camera was the intent was to make money out of it, to charge for a service, and I'm not so sure how healthy that is in comparison to picking up a camera with the idea of going out and exploring and creating. And certainly with the idea of going out and creating because of the fact that the camera is going to bring memories with it that will last a lifetime. I certainly, in my career, I wish that my approach would have been less commercial and more story driven and more inspired by being able to go out and create memories that were different. I also think that from a memory point of view, I wish that I had learned that creativity itself isn't about fitting in. It was about standing out. So again, there were many times that I wouldn't venture down the exploratory route and bringing in concepts with my photography because I was afraid that I might be leaving the DNA of photography too far behind. But now in my later career, I found out that it's the very fact that I've been able to take photography and put it into a process of creating art, that it's allowed my work to stand out more. And I wish I was early on in my career that I would have been able to embrace that a lot more. And I certainly wish that creativity, for the most part, I have found is probably more comfortable in the hands of imperfection In the early days of my career, it was all about perfection, as I've already shared with you. It was all about lenses, quality of lenses, lighting control, and being able to capture an image as perfect as possible. I wish I had learned early in my career that we can embrace imperfection. We can embrace those mistakes that sometimes come along and make something very special. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's a time where perfection, as I've said to you, is a beautiful genre in a certain type of photography. But it can't always be like that, because otherwise one's work just becomes predictable. And that is also something that I wish I had learned earlier on. So let's summarize. What is it that I am trying to say today? Well, as a photographer, amateur photographer, professional photographer, doesn't really matter. Whether you are a photographer that uses the camera as part of an artistic process doesn't matter. I think the intent needs to change. So for many of us, as I've said before in this discussion, certainly, based on my experience or where I've come from, picking up a camera was, for me, in most of my early career, was the intent of pleasing a client and creating something that had a commercial value to it. As I said, I wish that I didn't have that. I wish that I had more creative license. But when we pick up a camera, there shouldn't be the anxiety of trying to use it to its technical ability, to its highest technical ability. The intent should be not about what we're photographing, but how we're going to photograph it based on our inner emotions. How do we want the viewer to feel? What is the experience and what is the message we're conveying? And to be free within that. Remember that the camera gives us a license to create, but we need to find out why we are creating what we are creating. And remember that the camera, because of the fact that it can do all of this, is going to bring the most fantastic memories back to you. Life is made of memories. If you ask anybody what is their experience of life, they're going to talk about memories. What is it that they've gone through? Memories, memories, memories. And the camera will bring such good memories to the table. If we go out knowing that as we pick up the camera and we are going to create, we have the possibility of creating a memory that will last a lifetime. And even more importantly, remember that the world is not waiting for another Martin Osner or another Freeman Patterson. What the world needs is your unique voice, what you can create. So be inspired by other people's work, but always steal like an artist. Take a little bit from here and a little bit from there, find out what you like, put it together, and then create. And you too can create memories that inspire people, just like Dirk's photograph inspired me. Go well, everybody. Chat again soon. Bye-bye.